Everything changed. Faces no one could explain. Technology is decades ahead of its time. And one silent figure standing between Lincoln and Grant, who was never meant to be seen. Who was he? Why did Lincoln trust him? In this video, we dive into the photo that shook historians, stunned archivists, and revealed a secret hidden for over a century. What you're about to see isn't just a picture, it's a buried legacy. The photo that shouldn't exist. It started with a trunk, old leather straps, brass latch, barely holding together after decades of dust and heat in the attic of Claire Donovan's family home. She hadn't even planned to open it that day. She was just cleaning, organizing, maybe looking for a few antiques worth salvaging. But what she found instead wasn't just valuable. It was something no one could explain. Inside the trunk, she found what you'd expect: railroad bonds, lace gloves, faded letters, and a few scattered buttons. Then her hand brushed against something firmer, a leather photo album, cracked at the spine, its corners curling like dry leaves. Most of the images inside were black and white portraits, stiff poses, blank faces, all typical of the late 1800s. All except one. Tucked near the back of the album was a single photograph, sealed in wax paper. Unlike the others, this one had weight to it, thicker stock, sealed edges, and a faint scent that Claire couldn't quite place. Tobacco. Glue. Something old and strange. She didn't open it immediately. Not until the room was clean, the dust gone, and her curiosity unbearable. Claire pulled back the wax sleeve, and her breath caught in her throat. There, in haunting clarity, was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was dressed in a black frock coat. His unmistakable top had tilted in the sunlight, to the extreme right of the frame. Beside him, an empty wooden chair was placed, with several high-ranking Union officers around him, in mid-conversation, with drawn sabers at their sides making General Ulysses S. Grant and General George Meade part of history. But not so much for Claire. It took the color to shake her hands. Not hand coloring. No tinting or painting after the fact. This was all in full color. Deep blue Union uniforms, the dusty brown of the boots, the wood grain of the chair, even the creases in Lincoln's black suit catching subtle light, like a modern photograph disguised as a 19th century print. The caveat: color photography was impossible in 1865. Claire knew the photograph wasn't ordinary and took it to the only person she could trust, Professor George Kramer, the Civil War photography historian, who had once guest lectured at her university. When he first laid eyes on the print, he didn't utter a word but leaned in closer, his hands trembling. "You need to tell me exactly where you found this," he said in a low voice. Claire narrated the attic, the trunk, the wax paper, everything she could recall. Kramer did not blink. Instead, he pointed to the paper stock and said something that made her heart race. "That is Alabama silver print, from the 1860s. There is no way it should hold color." She asked the obvious question. "So, is it fake?" Kramer said in a low voice, as if the color had left his face. "No. That's the scary part. It's not fake." He arranged for experts at the New York Historical Society to analyze the photo for confirmation. There, Kramer with Claire examined the image under high-resolution equipment with a forensic imaging specialist and a paper conservator. What the lab had to say took the breath away. The pigments were not applied after printing, but in fact embedded into the photo itself. A process similar to early Kodachrome, but one that predates it by half a century. Unbelievable as it sounds, so confirmed the scanner. Color dyes, organic pigments, and photochemistry all dated back to some time in the 1860s. This not only violated the rules of photography, but also those of history itself. Claire, however, had eyes for something else, not the technology by which the experts were still toiling. Standing slim between Lincoln and Grant, a figure not found among Civil War archives or officer rosters. An anonymous fellow was barred from identification by Claire through the historical roster, but not from his face. What she would see next would lead to a closely guarded family legacy going back through a century of buried history. But the real mystery wasn't the color. It was who was standing between Lincoln and Grant, the man in the middle. The photo had already shocked everyone in the lab. The clarity, the color, the impossible chemistry. But while the others pored over pigments and paper stock, Claire couldn't take her eyes off the man between Lincoln and Grant. He wasn't like the others. The officer stood stiffly, decked out in well-earned stripes and ceremonial sabers. But this figure appeared understated. No rank displayed. No name she could match to known Civil War portraits. He wore a uniform, yes, but it lacked insignia. His expression? Focused. Steady. As if he weren't merely part of the photo, but part of something else entirely. Then it hit her. Claire had seen this face before, not in a textbook or an archive, but in a much later photograph from her family collection. She jerked up a scan on her phone. A 1912 image of a man standing outside a barn, one hand resting on a dog's head. He was older and heavier, dressed like a farmer, but the jawline, the ears, the slight slope of the eyebrows, it was him, the same man, standing beside Abraham Lincoln nearly 50 years earlier. That should be my great-great-grandfather, Claire whispered. Professor Kramer looked up sharply. What? She insisted on having him on the phone. Kramer leaned toward it, brow furrowed as he moved back and forth between the two images. He doesn't seem to show in any record for the Civil War. Kramer muttered more to himself than with any intent to include her. Could be a volunteer, maybe even a civilian caught in uniform. Much shaking of heads followed. No, William Donovan. I remember. There were some stories told by my grandfather. His grandfather had served in the Civil War, but had disappeared before it was over. No more particulars, just that he did not come back, otherwise listed as missing in action. She opened her computer and began searching for Civil War service records. Minutes later, Donovan, William found. Rank medics. Regiment 104th New York Infantry. Status missing in action. Last seen 6th April 1865. One entry. One note. No explanations given. Kramer still held his gaze on the screen. April 6th. Just 3 days before Lee's surrender. And Claire slowly nodded. So if he disappeared on April 6th, how does he picture himself on the day of April 9th? With Lincoln? At Appomattox? Kramer didn't answer. He was already busy digging through his own laptop, furiously typing away. A few moments later, he glanced up. There are no known photographs of Lincoln at Appomattox. Only engravings, sketches, and letters. But if it really would be the first image to capture it? Claire felt ludicrously proud, then equally terrified. Could it prove that her great-great-grandfather was more than the battlefield medic, or just at the wrong place at the wrong time? But if it was purposely framing him, if some mushroom had placed him in that photo with ill will, then someone else had made sure the world forgot. That did feel more than accidental. Erased records, vague family rumors, and a photo probably never meant for survival. But silence around Donovan was not some historical forgetfulness. It felt curated, constructed. Some much greater machinery had been set into motion in preparation for burying him until now. She suddenly remembered a very old letter her grandfather used to show her yellowed with age and barely readable. It had been written by William Donovan and was dated decades after the end of the war, but one line stood out. If ever you find the photograph with the chair, burn it. It was never meant to be kept. Did it in a flash. This picture was not simply the object of a bygone time. It was hazardous. That which is actually hazardous is plain to see. The air around her felt denser now, heavily loaded with the knowledge that nothing in history had ever been so stable as it seemed. The laboratory team showered its attentions elsewhere. Not Lincoln or Grant. Rather, they attended to the man in between, the one that history forsook. Not gone, but hidden. Not obliterated, but craftily brought to non-existence. And now, with the advent of the photograph, a re-emergent subject introduces the one question rarely spoken of: why? If William Donovan was declared missing, what was he doing beside Abraham Lincoln in a photo dated after his disappearance? Lincoln's hidden network. At first glance, William Donovan was an anomaly, standing silently in the most historically loaded moment of the Civil War, yet missing from every known roster. No military title, no promotion records, not even a death notice. Just a quiet footnote. Missing in action, April 6, 1865. But what if he wasn't missing at all? Back at the New York Historical Society lab, Professor Kramer dug deeper into War Department archives. Late that evening, he called Claire with a voice tight from hours of reading. "I found something," he said. "You need to get down here now." When Claire arrived, Kramer didn't waste time. He pulled up a rarely accessed field record from April 1865. It was just one line in a broader memo. WD. Move to shadow post per AL's request. Not to be logged. No weapons drawn unless required. Claire blinked. What's WD? War Department, replied Kramer. And Al. That's most likely Lincoln. It was a nickname some of his closest aides used in private communications. The room went dead silent. What had begun as a misfiled photograph was now attached to an official document suggesting something uncommon among historians, that in his last days, Lincoln may have created an informal shadow unit, one operating outside the public military hierarchy, one that included such men as William Donovan. As they continued to comb through records, another nugget turned up a field journal that referred to temporary escorts assigned for sensitive movement between command zones selected outside normal rank. These men had nobody of badges and no papers, only quiet orders to stand watch, report silently, and protect key figures, including the president. Claire was utterly dumbfounded. So you're saying that Lincoln built his own network? That is, a team outside the official military? Kramer nodded. There have always been rumors, but I've never seen anything more concrete than this. The most damning proof came not in words, but in the fabric. Elsa, the forensic imaging specialist, was adjusting the scan from the photo when she froze at Donovan's coat. There's something here, she said as she zoomed in slowly on the collar of his uniform. There was a tiny, meticulously stitched patch hidden underneath the fold of his jacket's lapel, mostly out of sight. Faint and worn, but quite identifiable. It read PC. Kramer leaned in. Presidential Escort Committee. Elsa went pale. That doesn't exist. Not officially, said Kramer, but there have been mentions of it in passing, coded communications, personal diaries from Lincoln's aides. The theory was that near the end of his presidency, Lincoln didn't trust his cabinet fully. He wanted to have some eyes and ears in the field, people who would report directly to him. The badge on Donovan's lapel was more than just a pretty detail. It was a touchstone, irrefutable evidence that he had not disappeared from view in the waning days of war, but had been reassigned and removed from his regiment and placed at Lincoln's side by Lincoln himself. But more questions arose. Why was this committee operational in secret? Why were its members undocumented? And why was Donovan allowed such prominence in the photo before fading into obscurity? Kramer leaned back, rubbed his eyes some more. Lincoln knew the war was coming to an end, but the peace had always teetered. He needed trustworthy people at that last moment. Not generals, not politicians. Ghosts. Ghosts like William Donovan. It was then that the strange placement of the empty wooden chair in the photograph suddenly took on a new meaning. Not merely a prop, but a marker. A space deliberately kept open. For danger, for decisions, for a moment when someone like Donovan might step in should things turn sour. Had Claire not looked closely enough, history might have missed it all. But the mystery had just begun to unravel. For swathed beneath the patch on Donovan's uniform lay the secret message, one line that would send chills down the spine of anyone who laid eyes upon it. But hidden deeper beneath that badge was a chilling message stitched by hand. The message that changed everything. The image had already cracked open questions about lost networks, secret assignments, and an unknown figure planted beside Abraham Lincoln. But as the team at the New York Historical Society lab continued their analysis, a new discovery shifted the weight of the photo from mysterious to chilling. It started with a closer look at William Donovan's uniform. Elsa, the forensic imaging expert, was scanning the lapel when something strange caught her eye. "Wait," she said, pausing mid-click. "There's more stitching here, not just the badge." Beneath the tiny PC insignia, stitched into the dark wool of the Union coat, was a sliver of thread, so faint it nearly blended into the fabric. It wasn't just a loose thread or a repair. It was deliberate, a stitched message. Elsa adjusted the spectral scanner and zoomed in. There it was, hidden in plain sight. A few careful words sewn with thread just one shade lighter than the jacket. Target verified. Stand until April 14th. The room went still. April 14th, 1865, the night throat. "Are you saying he knew?" No one responded right away. Kramer simply leaned over Elsa's shoulder, staring at the screen, as if trying to will the words into meaning something else. But there was no misreading it. If true, The message seemed to indicate that William Donovan Clare's great-great-grandfather was not only apprised of a threat to Lincoln's life, but also was perhaps assigned to track or guard Lincoln until that very date, the date of Lincoln's death. Target verified doesn't sound like routine patrol language. Mason, the paper conservator, at last said, "That sounds like an assignment." And stand until, Elsa admitted, suggests he was given a duration, not a location. He was close to Lincoln and was possibly involved in a final line of defense. Worse, he could have been a silent witness to a threat that materialized just before he could act. Suddenly, it didn't seem like a tragedy for him to disappear from all records. It was a cover-up. Clare remembered Donovan's old letter warning. If you ever find the photo with the chair, burn it. Now it made sense, so terrible that it could have wilted the strongest heart. The photo was not mere evidence of nunc absentia, but proof of knowledge, of forewarning, and maybe failure. What made the discovery all the more shocking, however, was the timing of it. The earlier archive memo said that Donovan had just been transferred to the shadow post 3 days before Lee's surrender on April 9th. That picture had barely recorded him mid-assignment, alive, present, assigned to stand down by April 14th. But there was no further documentation of him after that. He was to have stopped it. Clare whispered. Kramer did not answer. There were too many contingencies. Perhaps Donovan had the means to foil a plot, and yet did not. Perhaps he was waiting for orders that never came. Perhaps, darker yet, he was put out of the way before he had a chance to do anything about it. This much was certain. Someone had stitched that message onto his jacket. He was gone, knowing all too well what was about to happen. Whether it was for him only or perhaps left as a breadcrumb in case anything went wrong is hard to say. But that photograph, once dismissed as a curious artifact, had now converted into something entirely different. But the message also raised a terrifying possibility. Was Donovan silenced before he could act? The technology that shouldn't be. For days, the focus had been on the faces in the photo. Lincoln, Grant, Meade, and the mysterious William Donovan. But after the secret message beneath Donovan's lapel was revealed, Elsa, the forensic imaging expert, turned her attention to something just as baffling, the photo itself.